Good morning, everyone. I wanted to get the rudder on before I went out and ran some errands. It's a good opportunity to let the glue dry. The glue I'm going to be using only takes a couple hours to set, so by the time I get back, I'll be ready to get back to the build. There are a few steps that you want to take advantage of when the rudder is off the airplane. Your kit will come with some way of steering the tail wheel, and usually it's a bracket that mounts on the bottom of the rudder. Also, you want to make sure that your control horn and your servo arm geometry is set up the same, and that's easier to do when it's in your hand right in front of you instead of managing this big model. So what I'm going to do is show you the steps that I go through to do this. First, I use blue tape, masking tape. It doesn't stick to the monocoat too bad. It's easy to mark on and won't leave the marks on your plane when you're done. So I put the tape on the bottom of the rudder where I'm going to be attaching this. Grab a straight edge ruler and a pen. Now I'm not squeezing too hard here, but I'm holding the rudder in between my knees here. And set the straight edge up with the point of the rudder where the center line of the hinge is, and then the center line at the tip on the back. And just on the blue masking tape, draw a line, and that gives you your center line for the rudder. It's not 100% accurate, but it'll get you really close. That's what I've used for years, and it hasn't done me wrong. You can see here, I have the, there's a bad glare there. Here we go. I have the black line here that goes up to the center line of the hinge, and I just ran the straight edge all the way down to the center of the tip on the bottom of the rudder. Now what we'll do is we'll take the plate that goes on the bottom and put that right on that black line and match it up so that it sits underneath where your control horn comes through. For these smaller screws, I like to use a little finger drill to do the pilot holes. So once you have this lined up, like so, you can run your little pilot hole into the bottom. And now you can see we have two little holes here on the black line where the plate will mount. Simply remove the masking tape and you'll have your two holes there. Now at this time, what I like to do is put a little dab of the gap sealing CA on here. Then when I'm putting the screws through the plate and into the rudder, it's grabbing the CA and running into the wood, and it grabs, and you don't have to worry about your plate falling off in mid-flight. So let me get the CA out, and I'll get that rigged up, and I'll show you what I have when we're done. Alright. So what I have here is the two screws in the bracket on the center line without a mark. Lines up good with the control horn coming out both sides, so we'll have equal steering for our deflection when we're trying to get ready for takeoff. And the next thing is you want to get your control horn through the plane. Depending on the types of geometry that you have for your cables, whether you're using a direct linkage servo, pull-pull system, whether it be cable or push rod, you need to make sure that the geometry is correct. Otherwise you can force your servo to bind, cause undue stress on the airframe. I don't know, I guess there are a couple other things, but that's enough for me to worry about to make sure that it's right. I believe it was SWB that had a really good online pictorial and explanation of the different geometries. So check with your aircraft manufacturer and see which style they've designed the aircraft for. This one does a parallel cables for a pull-pull setup. So we're going to want this equal length at the control horn and at the servo arm. So let me get the control rods through there, and we'll get the hardware on and center it up, and I'll show you what I'm talking about. Okay, before I finish putting the control horn in the rudder here, you always want to use Loctite to seal up the threads and make sure that this doesn't come unscrewed in flight. You don't have to use a half a bottle. It's not like you're custom mixing epoxy or anything like that. You just need a dab. You want to make sure to shake it real good because it'll separate inside, and then you'll get just the runny bits and not the good bits, or you get a glob and not what you were expecting. But all you need is a little drop on the threads. You can kind of see there. Maybe not. I don't know if it's focusing. But I put some thread lock on there. And then you'll run the hardware down. And that'll make sure that it doesn't come off in mid-flight. I'm going to take a pair of pliers and snug it down. It's not one of those things where you need a French on it. It's just balsa wood. Don't break it. Also, when I put this control rod through the rudder, I used a little CA so that it's less likely to shift while I'm building it and keeping it centered. I just use a ruler, and this one turned out to 2.5 inches out on each side. And then it also has a jam nut, so you've got an extra level of protection here that it's not going to come undone. And this one I usually don't Loctite. The Loctite will hold steady on the inside, and this one uses the torsional strength, I guess, to hold it in place against the one that's Loctited on. Alright, let me get the plastic control horn ends on here, and I'll be right back with you. Alright, I've got my little plastic control horns on here that's going to be connected to the pull-pull cables, and I've got my servo arm. What I do is I mount the servo arm, just hold it over one of the screws from the plate on the bottom, and that gives me a center line, and then I can pinch it against that plate to hold it steady and adjust this so that the center line of the hole is lined up with the hole that you intend to use with your cable. For me, I'm using the outermost hole. Again, this goes into what geometry you're using. If you're crossing your rudder cables, don't use an offset horn. It can cause problems, and probably will. Alright, and there you can see how the horn lines up with the hole. And that makes sure that my geometry will be straight when I get it all put together. Let me go ahead and finish this up and I'll be right back with you. Alright, now we got these all situated. I'm going to be gluing the rudder onto the plane, and we want to make sure that when we set this, that the glue doesn't get inside the hinge. You might know someone who inadvertently glued their rudder in a deflected state, or so much glue got in there that it was stiff and they couldn't use it, had to break it loose and redo it. I like using Gorilla Glue. It only takes a couple hours to set. It's easy to work with, very strong, and just seems good. You can use epoxy. There are other ways of doing things, but this is how I'm building this one and how the manufacturer recommends it. As far as the style of hinges, the glue though, that's up to the builder's discretion, just what I like to use. Before we get the gluing though, the way we keep the glue from getting in the hinges is you use a little bit of Vaseline and a small screwdriver, and you just put a dab on each side of the hinge. Spread it around and just work it back and forth. And that gets Vaseline all inside the hinge, kind of lubricates it a little bit. You'll feel it soften up and it moves really easily. At this point, you know that if any Gorilla Glue gets in there, it's not going to bind up your hinge. So I'll go ahead and do the others and I'll be right back. Okay, so now there's Vaseline in all the hinges and they're free of motion, and I doubt there'll be any glue getting in there. Looking good so far. Next I'm going to set up my rig here. I told you I have these little adapters for my workbench. So I can bring it to an easy workable height that's hopefully good for you to see also. Get repositioned here. Now, Gorilla Glue expands a lot as it cures, so you don't need a whole lot of it. What I do is just put a little dab in the opening. And once I've got the little dabs in there, I take a Q-tip and cut off one of the cotton ends. And that gives me a nice soft stick to work with, where I can smear that around the inside of the hole, because it really doesn't take much, but you want to have adequate coverage to cover the whole hinge as it goes in. If you're just gluing a small part of it, it's not going to be as strong. That's a nice, easy way, and disposable. Now the activator for this glue is water. You don't have to use bottled water, and I'm not using bottled water either. I don't have a water source in the basement here, so I just keep a old water bottle filled with tap water. And I just get a little bit on my finger. And then just rub the hinge. It gets it moist, but not soaking wet. It just needs a little bit of water to activate and start the process. Then put all your hinges in to the fuselage. And once it's in, with the expanding, that could cause one hinge to come out and make a torque. What you want to do is hold this at a deflected state and use your tape to make sure that it stays. So I put a couple bands on the one side that I'm going to tighten up by being deflected. And this will hold all the hinges into the fuselage while the glue dries. Now I don't set this up to be a full 45-degree deflection while it's curing, so that if any glue comes out, I don't want it to glue the hinge together on the inside that way either. This allows everything to be pulled up tight against the fuselage while it cures, and it's sure that the hinge line is going to maintain centered. If you're building this from one that has both, where you've glued both sides into the rudder and the fuselage at the same time, as it's curing it could twist, and if all your center lines get off kilter, it's not going to pivot the same. So you always set it in a deflective state to make sure that the hinge line is always going to be free and clear of movement and on the same axis. So I'm going to let this dry, run a couple errands, and we'll check back in later.